the arms and ammunition and military equipment out of the magazine there in Williamsburg because he didn't want the colonists to have access to it. Patrick Henry said, we can't lose all of that because look what happened in Boston. We don't want to be defenseless. We need to be able to protect our ports and our property. And so they went after it, tried to retrieve all those weapons and gunpowder. He was also the first governor of a constitutional republic. There had never been one of these in the whole history of the world. So he not only had the job of becoming the first governor, but he had no pattern, no example to follow. And yet he established the office of governor and was elected to that office 6 times. And the last time, he didn't even know they elected him. But he declined the office because his health was failing. After betraying his country, Benedict Arnold switched over and became one of the British generals. And when Thomas Jefferson, who was governor of Virginia at that time in the early 1780s, and when Thomas Jefferson heard that the British were coming, he resigned his office as governor and fled to his mansion way out in the western counties, a place called Monticello, because he didn't want the British to catch him. And so he left the state or the Commonwealth in a time of great crisis. In a desperate need for help, George Washington, who was still fighting up north, knew that the British were trying a southern tactic coming from Georgia and then moving upward. He contacted who? Patrick Henry. And he pleaded with Patrick Henry to raise an army to help fight, go and join General Nathaniel Greene, who had only recently, a few months earlier, taken over command because the previous general had lost so many battles. Anyway, get some men and organize them and send them to help in the fight. Patrick Henry, because of the way people trusted him and admired him, he raised 2,500 soldiers out of the area where he lived in Virginia. And they streamed south to join the fight and eventually pushed the British back. Patrick Henry was the one who certainly helped George Washington because he warned George of a plot that was being organized against him to take over and kick him out of his position as the commander-in-chief. Patrick was also an early fighter. He was one of the first spokesmen speaking out for a more humane care for people with mental illness. He fought hard, demanding that the Constitution must also have a Bill of Rights. We have those rights today because of the efforts of Patrick Henry and George Mason, his close friend. That's why we have freedom of speech in our Constitution. That's why we have freedom of religion and all the other amendments that are contained in the Bill of Rights. In his efforts to end the stamp tax, he was charged with treason. And as a result, the British governor put a 2,000-pound reward on his head, which if he had been caught and captured, he could have been sent to England where he would never have received a fair trial. He was the only one of the founding fathers who left all of his surviving children, and there were a bunch, he left them all an inheritance, either lands which he had bought or actual money. He called on his fellow patriots to trust God, that God would send someone to help them. And 2 years before the Declaration of Independence was even signed, way back there, he said, God will help us, he will send help. And he wasn't like modern psychics who can make a statement and who knows if it ever comes true. He said, King Louis XVI of France will send us arms and munition and clothing, and he will send his fleets and his troops to help us fight the British. How in the world he could make such a prophetic statement, because that is exactly what happened about 4 or 5 years later. He was the first, at first fought against the ratification of the Constitution, but ultimately he switched and came to support it, not because he loved it, but because George Washington pointed out to him that without his strong voice, the state of Virginia probably would have rejected it, and therefore the nation would have been divided and could not easily be reunited. More than anything else, I want to tell you, one more thing. Patrick Henry was so famous and so popular that there were 2 counties in the south part of of the state of Virginia, right on the North Carolina border. There was one county called Patrick Henry County. And for whatever reason, they decided the two counties had to be split. And so there was a long-standing battle over who got to keep the name, Patrick Henry. And finally, it doesn't seem all that hard, but finally it was decided we'll name one county Patrick and the other county Henry. And there they are down at the bottom. One has a red dot, the Henry County, and Patrick next to it. More than anything else, I want to tell you and close with Patrick Henry's final moments. Because for me, they are the most moving and most, at other times, most triumphant aspects of his whole character. In June of 1799, Patrick Henry wrote a letter to Edward Fontaine and told him and the family, "Dear Patsy," and he actually wrote it to his daughter, I am very unwell and have Dr. Cable with me." Henry was letting his family know that he knew his life would not go on much longer. Fontaine says that as soon as the family got word, they packed up and traveled 2 days and came to Red Hill where he was living and found him sitting in a large old-fashioned armchair, which was more comfortable than his bed. Dr. Cable then told Patrick that he had exhausted all the other treatment options. There was only one left. Taking a small vial of liquid mercury, kind of stuff you put in a thermometer, liquid mercury from the doctor, and looking at it for some moments, Patrick asked, "I suppose, doctor, this is your last resort." The doctor told Patrick that he had a bowel blockage, which probably had become infected, and that's what was causing his intense suffering. Then Patrick asked, "What will be the effect of this medicine?" The doctor told Patrick, "It will give you either some relief or," and the kind-hearted doctor was too much affected to even finish his sentence. To that, the dying patriot calmly asked, "You mean, doctor, that it will either give me relief or prove immediately fatal?" Dr. Cable answered and said, "You can only live a short time without it, and it may possibly relieve you." Hearing that, Patrick put on a silk cap, which he usually wore instead of a wig, and he said, "Excuse me, doctor, give me a few moments." And then, still holding the vial in his hand, Patrick bowed his head, sitting in his chair, and he prayed audibly a very fervent, childlike prayer, asking God to prepare him for his death, and also seeking God's care and welfare for his family and for his country. At the end of his prayer, he lifted the vial and took it to his lips and swallowed the mercury without any emotion. In the meantime, while he was praying, Dr. Cable, who was a skeptic and an unbeliever, but also Patrick's close friend, he left the house and ran out, overwhelmed with sorrow, and threw himself on the ground under an oak tree, and there he wept bitterly. But he soon returned to his patient whom he found looking at the blood congealing now under his fingernails, and comforting his wife and family who were weeping around him. Among other things which he said, after expressing his gratitude for the goodness of God to him for all his days, Patrick added, "I feel truly thankful to my Heavenly Father, who after blessing me all my life, is permitting me now to die without suffering any pain." His voice was clear and distinct, and his last words were addressed to Dr. Cable. He fixed his eyes affectionately upon the doctor and said, "Doctor, throughout our times together, I have used many arguments to try to convince you of the truth and the wonder of the Christian faith. Now I will give you my last argument by showing you how a Christian can die." Moments later, he ceased to breathe, and without making a sound, his mighty spirit passed from earth and time. What a life. What a hero he was. Thank you. He didn't use a spoon when he stabbed himself. And I've read differing accounts. Some say that he actually had a letter opener and poked his chest enough to cause some blood to form as he fell into the pew in the church. Others say no, and having seen that at Red Hill, his final home, there is in a case the letter opener that he held in his hand that day, and it looks far too blunt to puncture not only his vest but his skin. So I don't know what's actually true. Yeah, there's a picture of the paper cutter that was actually the one he held that day.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
You don't know the visual, how much you learn for me from somebody else presenting a story than reading it from a book. You made it live.
I cut over almost 4 pages out of this speech,
Oh, my
which was like cutting off my fingers because I wanted to tell that
Yes.
story too.
Well, you know it so well, and you have so much exciting for it. Thank you
You're welcome.
very much. We will adjourn. I want to just remind you that in April, we have another Presents program. And it'll be an author and photographer. Her name is Anne Cranes, or Crans. And she will be presenting stories and pictures of Michigan. And I understand she was very interesting too.